My name is Natasha Cica and I'm the co-editor of this wonderful issue of Griffith Review, Tasmania the Tipping Point, co-editor with Julianne Schultz. This issue is a special collaboration between Griffith Review and the University of Tasmania, where I work, where I'm the director of something called the Inglis Clark Centre, whose brief is to advance our university's thought leadership and community engagement agenda. So I welcome you all tonight, and I welcome three of our wonderful contributors to this issue, which I may say has gone off like a bomb. It's flown out of the warehouse and is now in reprint, which is very, very nice. First, at the end, is Scott Rankin, who is a writer and for 20 years has been the creative director and executive producer of Big Art. His collaborative projects have won many awards. He's an Australia Council Fellow and lives on the northwest of Tasmania with his partner, artist Rebecca Lavis, and their children Tassie, Lockie and Ginger. And I did say to him at the last event that his work, Namatjira Big Art's work, is, I think, one of the most beautiful pieces of theatre I've seen in a long time. So thank you again for that. Because it has taken, it's a national story, not just a regional or Tasmanian story. To his immediate right, is that the right? Is Joe Chandler, who is a Walkley Award-winning freelance journalist and very happily the winner of the inaugural 2012 UNSW Bragg Prize for Science Writing. She focuses on climate science, environment and health issues, as well as the aid and development sector. She is the author of an acclaimed book on climate science, Feeling the Heat, which was published in 2011. And last but by no means least, immediately next to me is Favel Parrett, who is the author of the also wonderful book Past the Shallows, published in 2001, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award in 2012. She's a current fellow of the Australian Antarctic Arts Fellowship and has actually just come back from Antarctica, and she's also written for Griffith Review. So without further ado, I'll get our ball bouncing and ask each of the panellists why Tasmania, what inspired you to write for this issue, and do you think that there's anything special about Tasmania and its place in the national imagination? So I'll start with Scott.
Thank you. I went from Sydney in 1981 to Burnie. In Sydney, I lived on a Chinese junk and I had ducks for pets, and my mother was a early childhood enthusiast and my father was a woods craftsman, and it was, the most wonderfully idyllic kind of Sydney life. And I took off from there straight from home and went to Burnie in Tassie and found a better place to live. So there was something, I don't know if you know Burnie, but there was something in the hardcore industrial, polluted harbour, pristine environment, unpolluted souls, proximity to wilderness, look you in the eye, tell you what you think, kind of life there. And I immediately met the most compelling people and made friends with them that I've ever met. And so it struck me at the time as a sort of Sydney boy that he was it didn't strike me quite at the time, but it became rapidly apparent that he was a fantastic springboard to build a career, if you like, in that money turbine that is playwriting. And also to establish a national arts company. That was 10 years after that.
That's really the obvious thing to do in the Northwest Coast, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was born on the Northwest Coast, so I can say that, yeah.
So, for instance, today, and I'll shut up in a second, but today to get here I had some workshops in Melbourne. I got up 40 minutes before the plane. It's 10 minutes to an airport with a little Rex, twin propeller. I could leave my car parked for nothing. I can leave the key on the tyre. There's no security. They've already allocated the seat that I need and call me by name. I had a chat with the security. The guy who does the ticking off thing, and about philosophy and how he's changing to study psychology, and then got on the plane into my favourite seat and flew to Melbourne, and this time I didn't, but there is a guy who has antique Mercedes here in Melbourne, and he'll pick you up from the airport and get you to town like that, faster than coming from Mount Martha, or even with tonight's gridlock from Brunswick. So there is a wonderful connection facing north from this springboard with these incredible people and beautiful culture into other little stepping stones like that little place Melbourne as you head to other centres of world excellence.
And I think for those of you who haven't yet read Scott's piece, and I urge you to, because it's contained in the book, he very much captures the gist of what he's just said in his piece, and stretches the envelope quite provocatively. I really was very fond of that piece because of the unplugged nature of a lot of its writing. So I'll go from the Sydney boy to the Melbourne girl. Why Tasmania? Why did you pitch into this space for us?
I'm just recalling when you talk about your flight up here. I think the first Tasmania, Hobart, was my first overseas destination on an aircraft when my parents won a raffle when I was 12 years old, and so we all flew down. My father was terrified, had never been on a plane before, and we had a really rough landing at Hobart, and I remember the plane coming in and swinging over the water and turning around, and I remember I was in the back seat, and the one hostess flight attendant said to the other one, "He can take the bloody thing back himself. I'm not getting back in this weather." And my father's pate was white by the time we left the plane. But after that, I remember doing the usual Tasmanian devils and the convict settlements and these beautiful bridges at Richmond, and sort of sucking up all this history and being a bit intrigued by this place that was more like what I imagined an English countryside would look like. But really, in terms of any deep engagement with Tasmania, it sort of started when I began really trying to delve into climate writing, and it just kept factoring everywhere. Initially in dealing with a fellow called Graham Pearman, who is the head, or was the head of CSIRO's atmospheric division, and he set up Cape Grim in your part of the country, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sort of figuring that this was an incredible location, and sort of second only to that Hawaiian location which has been producing that amazing graph showing the planet breathing for all these years, and this matches that and has done since the 70s. And then really the last 5-6 years, because I became interested in the Antarctic program and what that was telling us about the world and about the planet and the atmosphere, and I think Barry Lopez has this beautiful quote about how it's it's sort of the looking glass through which we can see really the whole story of the planet in the history and the current and the future, and it's the laboratory. So I guess the last 5-6 years I've spent a lot of time in Hobart mostly, either training and preparing to go down to Antarctica, communing with this quite amazing group of people who I guess you'll talk about a little bit more as well. They're this sort of strange grab bag of logistics folk, adventurers who are sailors or pilots, or survival specialists, and then these scientists at the most elite levels, and they work in these incredible collaborative teams doing this amazing stretching work. So really, and a lot of time in Hobart waiting to see whether the weather would let us down.
Indeed. And I think, Joe's piece captures this sense of Tasmania, especially Hobart, as a laboratory, peopled by some very interesting lab rats quite beautifully, and also is cross-generational. I really like that aspect of your piece. She goes back and traces the influences upon current research scientists. So I grew up in Hobart, even though I was born up north, and so that whole thing in your piece about looking north, when you're down where in that part that we know, and I live half my life on Bruny Island, you're really looking south. Antarctica is there. There is nothing between you and it.
You can feel it.
You can feel it. You can smell it, which is a really great segue into Favel, because you've just been there, and also your beautiful fiction, exquisite fiction, really, to my mind, captures that southeastern mentality in Tasmania and atmospheric delightfully. So would you like to talk about that?
Sure. I grew up in Hobart, and but I didn't get there till I was about 6, and the way we got there was by a ship, and it was the first time that I'd seen the ocean proper, so not the bay. And it was an extremely rough trip, which it can be on the Bass Strait, and it was just terrifying. So in the night, my brother and I were sailing to this place that we knew. Where is this place? It's at the end of the earth, I think. And then arrived in Devonport and drove down on the bus and got to this town, Hobart. And Hobart to me never felt like home. I never connected with it. But then when I moved back and moved to Melbourne and started writing, it just kept coming up in my writing over and over and over. And my first book, Past the Shallows, is set in the far south, which is a place I only lived for a year, but it really had an effect on me. So it was really vivid. It came back so strongly. And my next book is more about when I was young, I used to hang around the wharf area quite a bit. I used to get the ferry to school on the eastern shore. So I used to see these massive, they weren't icebreakers back then, but ice-strengthened vessels from Denmark and Germany and Norway come in every summer and be there every couple of weeks. So they used to do the resupply for the Australian Antarctic Division. And I became really obsessed with these ships heading out to this amazing, or the White Continent, this place, very south. And I forgot about that as well, and it came back. I was cleaning up and I found a photo of this beautiful ship called the Nella Dan that I used to love, a Danish ship. And she ran aground in 1987 on Macquarie Island and then was scuttled. But I used to love her, and my dream was to work on her. And so that all came back, and I started writing about it. And I've, in a way, fallen in love with Hobart properly this time, and going back and revisiting the places that I lived and seeing them through different eyes, and realising what a beautiful and sad place it was, but what an effect it had on me, and that I'm grateful for it. Yeah.
So what is different? I mean, I'll open this to all of you. What is there something different and special about Tasmania? And if so, what's the hook? Why don't you go and write in Denmark or Dubbo or Dubai? What is it about Derby?
Aren't we going to hear about your Tasmanian?
Oh, my Tasmanian.
Yeah.
Oh, well, a little like Favel, I grew up in Tasmania. Although I have a continental European surname, my mother is many generations Tasmanian. Again, this story is in my opening essay in the book, and my family goes back to the 1850s. It has many Liberal politicians in it. But I grew up there resenting. When I grew up in Tasmania in the 1980s, I resented the isolation, the sense that we were off the map of where everything happened, compared to, for example, when I went to see my family in Europe, who seemed to be so plugged in to world conversations. And it was expensive to fly in and out. There was no internet, and there was no privacy. Everywhere you go, somebody knows your business, or think they know your business, and make it up. And as a young and immature woman, that was too much for me. So I went to the other side of the world and was away for 20 years, and then was literally seduced back by the beauty and indeed the story of the loss of Lake Pedder and the efforts that a wilderness photographer called Alagus Tricanus made with a circle of Tasmanian watercolour painters to try to save the lake. So I went back to write that book, partly because the light was wrong in Sydney. So for me, the hook was the light, and also the way people were with each other. There was a kind of gentleness and an intimacy of community, and as a 20-year older woman, I welcomed that embracement by the community, but I do find that it tips as well. Again, you get that suffocating feeling quite often and have to leave. So I think it's interesting that two of you don't live there. Do you want to maybe talk to that, Scott? Because the community you live in is even smaller than the one I inhabit in Hobart. Do you find it gets claustrophobic?
No. I live 35 minutes from Burnie, which is that's a long, long way. I would maybe go into the city once a fortnight or maybe once a week, except my daughter's just started dancing, so now it'll be every week. And I live where I am, there's 16 houses. We can see one of the lights twinkle and they can see ours. And I'm so crazily passionate about how productive life can be and how fortunate to be born into this generation of first world people at a time when there's more money, resource than any other point of human history, and that I've got 600,000 hours from birth to death if I'm lucky because I'm full of protein, and I've got about 200,000 hours of making time left, and I'm a genius. So I have to be really diligent with whatever that is, so being in Melbourne, the city that I love the most in the country, is a hedonistic feast of distractions, and I'm so not interested in repetition of other people's vision, and not interested in and sort of. As the time down there has gone on, sort of assaulted by the homogeny of owls and swallows and and ephemera of the edge of the urban bearded elite. Oh, I didn't have a shame. That washes across us in an attempt to get on a bandwagon to make a little bit of stuff, a little bit of money, and to me that I've become almost. It's an allergy to that. So to find the mental space and to, as a dear friend of mine uses the phrase, to be in a place where the eyes aren't on you is such a luxury. Yes, there's been some fires in the last little while up where we are, and so there have been a few text messages. Is there a fire? Are you okay? Yeah, okay. But there's a lot of freedom, in the relationships and this silence, and you can do a 12-hour writing day, and it is such a hedonistic luxury in one sense to release the time to make. And there's not a traffic light, I'm never at a traffic light.
I think that question as well of deliberately positing oneself outside what I like to call the magic triangle of ideas, Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, where everything's supposed to happen that's leading is really interesting, especially if you're positing yourself on the wet, green, southerly edge. But you two don't live in Tasmania, so I'll start with Favel because you do have a deed. Would you come back and live and write where we live and write?
When I go to Hobart for the first 3 days, I think yes, and then I think no after that. And it's only because of the way I used to feel comes back a little bit. And freedom is an interesting thing. I think you've chosen to live where you are, but as a child I had no choice, and I was suddenly on this island that I found very isolating. It was $500 to fly to Melbourne.
It was bad.
So it was $1,000 each way to go both ways. And the transport was terrible if you lived anywhere outside of Hobart. So you spend a lot of time walking hills in the cold. These are my memories. I remember winter especially more than summer. And I felt a distinct lack of freedom. And I think my obsession with these ships that would sail out to these amazing places and come from Europe was this idea of freedom that I wanted. And I wanted to go with these people and get off this island. Now when I go back, I go back by choice, and I see how amazing it is. I walk around Battery Point, where I lived for a short time when Battery Point was a dead town and was very run down. And rough. And no one believes you now because it's so gentrified and it's just so stunning. You've got the mountain on one side, the river on the other side, views everywhere, and these beautiful old houses that are just spectacular. And now cafes and bars and galleries and life on the street, and that's what was missing in the early 80s, life. And I would walk around those streets and I would be the only person on those streets. To me it was a dead town full of ghosts, cold and oppressive. And that's lifted now. So when I go down there, I have friends who have moved back and love it, and have successful art careers and are producing amazing work. And I do think I could do it, but my memories are still holding me back a little bit. Maybe when I finish this book, I'll be free of them.
And what about you, Jo? Do you think you'd be an emigre?
I will ask a question.
Yeah.
I mean, you've both talked about, I guess, the oppressive nature of growing up there, and you're raising children. I'm interested to know what your children think about the existence that I guess you've chosen for them at this stage.
They're not talking to me. No, look, well, interesting. Darcy, the oldest one, he just got on the boat on Monday night to study at Melbourne Uni and do architecture. One of the great blisses is that in this, supercharged child rearing culture of ours, that people have to leave. It's a great thing that Rebecca had a little weep, and I said, here's $50 and some oil for the car, and off he went. And it's magnificent. And in the year he had a gap year. He didn't go to Europe. He went and got his ticket at to essentially a coxswain's ticket to work barges. He took some cattle from Flinders Island to Eden on a barge, and then he sailed 2 yachts across Bass Strait and returned one after the Hobart to Sydney, and just had this fantastic waterborne life. And now he's off to Melbourne Uni. There was a bit of a shock for them when we got down and started to do the maths of what would they make if they ran a couple of potties with the cow, the guy who's got the cows next door, and they could get through. They could just run it with him, and they'd have to do all the stuff with the arm and bathing things and pulling ticks off things, but they would get $300 for a potty, and they were sort of calculating, that sounds good. Then they just went in their room and got on social media, and that was it.
I mean, the whole thing about the Tasmanian childhood as well. Another one of my favourite pieces in this collection is David Walsh's piece. David Walsh, who started Mona, and David's written a lot about his childhood in various contexts to try and explain the impetus for setting up this extraordinary museum. And he talks about running away from Mass, I think, from St Joseph's Church, which was our local church, to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery and looking at the collections there. And that resonates very strongly with me. So as well as this sense of no privacy, I did have a sense of there being cultural spaces filled with quite beautiful things, and did that whole idea of the Wunderkammer filled with exotica from all over the world and weird collections was very formative. So it's a bit of a bittersweet thing, the Tasmanian childhood, and I expect that for contemporary children, even though they are, like all children, first world children in the world, much more plugged in to people everywhere because of the technology, there's still, I imagine there's still some sense of that, and I do observe that in the young children I know. But would you come and join us? Would you pack up and leave?
I've thought about it. Yeah? Like everybody, I think every tourist that's there for a few days and you're staying somewhere near Battery Point and get on your running shoes and have a walk around that beautiful space and Errol Flynn territory and up on the point and think this would be pretty special. I've never got beyond that moment, but I think if I could find a way to support myself, I'd probably think about it for a couple of years at this stage. But I just find it's interesting, I guess, within the scientific community, and they're the people that I'm most plugged into, and yet I'm an outsider in that community because I'm not a scientist myself. But I find them so intriguing because of both the scientific calibre, but also then this sort of these hanger-on group of support crew, the pilots, as I said, and the logistics people, and this whole enterprise that's built up around the science. But I'm just thinking then, when you were talking about David Walsh's growing up experience and I guess how he found inspiration in what was there and clues to where he was going, there's this. One of the scientists I talk about in my piece is who grew up in Glenorchy, the son of a post-war migrant. His name's Andrew Klekochev. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. He's an astrophysicist, and basically he talked about how, as a small child, he was just fascinated with the auroras, and Then his father, who worked in the workshops for the hydro, and knew other immigrants there who were pretty smart with such things, they made him in the workshops on the weekends his own telescope. So yes, you do. So then he would look at the auroras with his telescope, and his idea of sort of goofing off for an afternoon at 15 and 16 was to go and sneak into the University of Tasmania and sit up the back for the lectures by Professor Ellis about radio astronomy. And this sort of became his idea of, you know, what he wanted to explore, and quantum physics and what answers and things might be there. And these days, he's evolved into one of the people that can tell us the most about what's happening with the ozone layer. So I just think, and he's had many opportunities to go elsewhere. I think when he finished his studies, he was offered a place with the NASA Jet Propulsion Unit to do his work, and he chose Macquarie Island. And he's never left. You know, he loves it. And I found a lot of fascinating stories. I guess it's this sort of the same thing as interweaving of space, of place, and the opportunity of geography, and of being under this particular piece of sky where he had access to, you know, the whole scheme of the universe.
Well, also that community that you're talking about, that cluster of scientists, one interesting dimension of it is that partly because our community is a small one in total, people can't ghetto off or silo off the way they can in larger population centres. So the bumping up between the science geniuses and the humanities geniuses, and he's right, he's one, is, I think, another really interesting characteristic of our society. One of the first things I did when I went back nearly 8 years ago was a freelance piece for the Fin, which was about the Antarctic tourism industry, and interviewed Sir Guy Green, who is now chair of 10 Days on the Island, chair of TMAG, whatever. So he's very much known as an arts person. One of his great loves was Antarctica, and when he was governor, he did a lot of work to try and build capacity and give that community a sense of itself as a whole, including in terms of how the science and arts intersected. So maybe the other two of you want to talk about, because you're both nominally more in the arts space. Do you want to talk about that?
I just thinking of gifts, artistic gifts that Tasmania gives you, and there are so many. Auroras are one that I was lucky enough to witness as a child that you just wouldn't see if you grew up in Melbourne, and that's brilliant. Things like the seabird life, being that connected, and the wilderness, being able to walk from Hobart halfway up the mountain and be completely in the bush, doing outdoor ed at school, really hardcore outdoor ed, like survival stuff that I am so grateful that I did now. So many gifts that have made my artistic life rich. So, you know, it wasn't all bad. Just at the time, I didn't enjoy much of it or take it in. But now I can see, and the ocean, the gift of the ocean right there, you know, an island. You're on an island and you really know you are. Tassie.
Scott, what do you think about that idea of the science and the humanities jostling up against each other? Maybe you don't get it so much on your remote twinkling property.
Yeah, I mean, tertiary education is not on the agenda essentially for young people growing up. You're going to be a hairdresser, or if you're lucky, a welder kind of thing. That's the pitch of it. I think there are probably 12 hairdressing salons in the main street of Wynyard, which is a town of 5,000. No, not quite. It's... if you look at Tasmania, it's because we can get bogged down in, it's pretty and it's an island, and there's sort of two other things that strike me. There's 500,000 odd people there. It's half the population of Wollongong lives there, with 3 levels of government, and its own orchestra, and
29 councils, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, it's quite a big number,
and there is something, you know, if you think of the kind of springboard effect of something makes the spring coil creatively inside you. So you do have I mean, certainly if you live in Launceston or Hobart, you're taking the chips and dipping them in sauce and throwing off your shoulder and throwing them at each other. But the Northwest Coast is a bit different to that. But there is a general sense of a coiled spring to achieve if you can get your eyes up, that I don't think is boxed in by UTAS or this kind of tertiary trajectory necessarily. And it's made a lot of people that I know from the Northwest Coast go on to be, big in their field, big here in Melbourne, big independent music people. And there's something about the coiled spring and that idea that you could never be at the cultural centre, and then the eyes that aren't looking at you, and then what an easy leap it is to make over the mainland. So you're not aspirational about mainland cities necessarily. That fires up the creative spirit in. I wouldn't restrict it to the humanities, and I don't really know your area, but and then there is this. So that's the outward thrust. I'll get to the end of this in a second. That's that sort of outward leap, or the energy to go outward, and then there is the island borders and the kind of really deeply serious bed of Gothic narrative. If you pick up on Greg's essay, which is one of the, I read it as a meditation, where he captures.
That's Greg Lemon's essay.
Yeah, where he captures.
In the book.
It's easy to wag your finger at Tasmania and go, use the G word and talk about genocide, but we in this room today, every second woman who comes to the attention of police in our country in the notebook is Indigenous. It's not a thing. Genocide is not a thing of the past. If you look at, we had the Closing the Gap discussions a fortnight ago. What is closing the gap? If we're requiring people to close the gap this way, is it not assimilationist? What about my children, closing the gap for my children, with them deepening their spiritual quest by their time in the desert? Let's close that poverty.
Just jumping in there.
Sorry,
that's
I'm
no. That's what you're here to do. But one of the things I'm proudest of in this issue is the fact that we have been able to step into the space of talking about what reconciliation looks like in Tasmania, because it looks different in lots of ways from mainland Australia. And so we've got that very strong piece by Greg Lehman, a very moving photo essay by Julie Goff, and a really fantastic piece of journalism by Kathy Marks, who's the Independent's Australian correspondent, which explained a lot to me about the internal politics of Tasmania's Aboriginal community. So that's certainly it's a very important part of it, and I'd actually urge you to read it just for those pieces. But we also have curated a much larger whole. One of the things I like about the book is we have a variety of voices, some of whom I know strongly disagree. The piece by Jonathan West has been picked up as a real provocation, because just bouncing off the thing you said about, I'm not talking about tertiary educated people. I wasn't presuming that we were. A lot of the people I know who are great science people and great humanities people didn't go past high school in Tassie, they just do it. But then that whole question of the socio-economic mapping of Tasmania is kind of interesting. As people who many would categorise as part of the elite, what do you think about that? What do you think about that kind of the kind of sneering that is often directed at Tasmania as being somehow backward, stupid, ill-educated, all the things that people like to say about Tasmania? What would your response be? Hard question, possibly.
I mean, I can jump in, but I talk a lot. So
no, you can. Well, Joe. What do you think about that?
My view is warped by the circles in which I've been moving, and that was actually a question that I've asked a lot of the scientists who go down there and make a life there, how much they engage more broadly with Tasmanian community, or whether they kind of silo and isolate themselves. And a couple of the younger ones did sort of quietly confess that they do sort of tend to cloister quite a bit, that there is such a strong, vibrant, large community of interest. Why would you go outside it? And because often it's not just their scientific work, they'll be, have sort of similar philosophies about politics, environment, and so they don't sort of necessarily feel the urge to move outside it. Some of the younger ones with families talk about how they want to engage, and they become engaged once their kids hit school and things like that. But it's interesting talking to the older scientists. They're quite worried now that if there is any sort of diminishment of the scientific enterprise in Hobart, that you risk this sort of the brain drain and the consequent generational decay, because you really need these incredibly alluring, vibrant, powerhouse science figures to draw down young, hot scientists who want to do their postgrads, who think they'll go for 2 or 3 years, but end up interbreeding and never get to leave. So there's sort of a particular moment when they're there, and that's when they get to keep them. And I guess they become an enclave of sort of a brains trust, I would imagine. And so I guess I feel a bit unqualified to talk beyond that circle, because I've spent so much of my time within that cohort.
Favel, what about you? What about the people you grew up with?
It's a hard one, because I'm going back to the early 80s, and I don't live there anymore, but it has changed a lot. The community that we lived in the very far south, sort of at the end of the paved road, was pretty rough. There was a very, very high unemployment rate, high domestic violence, high domestic violence, lots of massive marijuana plantations in the forest that were the main sort of breadwinner of people down there. And it was a sort of a place that police just didn't go. And it's changed a lot. And those people are still around and down there, and Dover still has its characters, and further south still does, and unemployment is still a massive issue down there. But I have noticed that it's changed. Hobart was it wasn't very multicultural, and that's changed. Hobart was... Somewhat. I mean, I've got some stories of literally, because my brother and I came from Melbourne, I've literally been surrounded in the street and hassled and said, "Go home, city slickers," that kind of thing. So they were my early memories of arriving in Hobart and sort of being an outsider from the big smoke. But as I grew up, and my teenage years were a bit different than that, and it's interesting thinking about arts in Hobart when a time when Triple J radio station didn't broadcast to Tasmania, so we had local radio, we had local bands, and when there weren't venues to play in, there were gigs at people's houses and things like that. People made their own sort of art and bands, and there was a vibrant scene actually. So it's interesting. It's changed a lot, though. It has.
I think one of the things that's changed, and we've each spoken about this before, is the way the environmental debates have played out. And I still think outside Tasmania there is a lingering caricature of greenies versus developers, forestry people, whatever. When I moved back 8 years ago, if we'd published the essay in the book by my former student Will Bibby, who's now at Oxford, drilling down into guns and its corporate culture and the small c corruption of that, we would never have had the Premier of Tasmania launching it in the town hall to a capacity crowd, which we did 2 weeks ago. And the Premier was Paul Lennon, and the community was very polarised, and people I knew were losing their jobs and livelihood because they spoke out on forestry issues. But now it's still contentious. I'm not meaning to downplay that, but it seems to me that there is more of a space open, and I'm hoping that we've contributed to that, to a more nuanced conversation about what the environment means to us, what development looks like, what sustainability is, what's the role of 29 councils and all layers of government in that. And maybe I'll bounce that one back to you, Scott. Is that your impression?
Yes, I think we're at a really interesting time, and I think Jonathan's essay, which looks at the economics of stuff, is really important to be in there. But the preoccupation in the media to look at the economic questions first, rather than it's a support, it's a structure that assists. It's just how many jobs, whereas if you look at the kind of, there is that outward springboard, but there's also this inward thing to look at the small scale and the beautiful and the bespoke and the expression of your own soul and the way that relates to your neighbour, and those things are fermenting at an incredible rate in Tasmania. It's happening elsewhere in the country, obviously, as well, but the island nature of it, the edges of it, are kind of hothousing it in a really good way that I think is making it. When you read the Asian paper, and you think of the proximity to Tasmania, to the 21st century, to the work of it's not Lenny Henry, the other Henry, not the comedian, the economic guy, Ken Henry. That's right. It's a magnificent opportunity at exactly the right time because of scales, and those economics are, in my mind, they're about looking at what's under the ground, not the expression of what we're doing.
Well, and indeed, so much of it, my impression is so much of it's not measured yet, or indeed immeasurable or intangible. So there seem to be all kinds of clusters of people doing things that nobody knows about, and then they pop up. I mean, a bit like your theatre company, it popped up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the second biggest cultural export from Tasmania. The TSO have better funding. We're working in far more communities, and I think there's, now there's probably 27 people employed around the country, and people going to London to work. With
a strong social justice / educative imperative, which again is I think, especially coming from Tasmanian grassroots, is a very important component of that. What I might do now is throw it open to questions from our audience. So I'll let we can't actually see you because of the lights, so the people who are helping will do that.
I just wanted to ask her opinion on...
Can you say your name, sorry?
Megan Yimmer. I'm from Devonport, left in 1998 to come and study at Melbourne University, just like your son, because I got into Tassie, but not for music, so I had to come to Melbourne. What do you think of the recent Tasmanian bushfires and Mel Long and all the effort put together? I was involved with Dunalley Primary School, trying to rebuild, and just the amazing effort of people pulling in, and all these Tasmanians popping out of the woodwork that perhaps in the past had denied their heritage, were saying, I'm Tasmanian, I'm proud of it. What did you think of that?
I think that's a question for Tasmania.
That's a good thing. Fantastic, yeah.
Well, I was really moved by it. I went out to the Hobart Showgrounds with a whole lot of clothes and shoes because I have too many of both. And a lot of people had lost everything, and was just stunned by how many people were there volunteering, packing, sorting. It was incredibly moving. And if you want to read something on that, the Griffith Review, this issue also has an online component. We're rolling out pieces through to the end of March. So go onto the website. There's a beautiful piece by a novelist called Arabella Edge, who lives on the East Coast, who was in those fires, and it's about what it was like to have that coming towards you and survive it. So it was frightening. It was a frightening time, and up to last week we still had fires bearing down on us, and my smoke alarm was going off at Bruni from fires in Molesworth. But good community, a good reminder of the power of what a community can do. I don't want to answer all the questions though. Can we take another one? Yeah.
There's a go? Okay. Henk van Leeuwen is my name here. I love Tasmania, been dozens of times, very familiar with it. One of the great things, it's got the purest form of democracy in the world, one vote, one value, the Hague-Clark system, absolutely fantastic. It's got 510,000 people in an area which geographically is the same as the Netherlands and Denmark combined, which has a population of 22 million people, which is the same population as Australia. What do you think of the proposition? This might be a little bit political, but I am, of course, very pro-migration in the sense that I very much like Australia to play its role in processing refugees onshore rather than offshore. Right? It costs us $2,700 a night to house somebody in a tent in Nauru, on Manus Island. It would cost us $125 if we did it within the community. I've just been to Tasmania again, went to Queenstown, population 8,750 is now 1,250 for certain reasons, spoke to the newsagent who's just leaving town. What would you think of the proposition, instead of offshore investing $4 billion to put it onshore and invest it in Tasmania and say, let's take all of our refugees, however many, to Tasmania, keep them there for a while, and help indeed that wonderful part of Australia to flourish, to provide economic investment, and to give people a fantastic destination for the rest of their life.
Would anyone like to comment on that?
We should be taking more refugees full stop through the whole country, in my opinion, and we should be processing them here, not offshore. So I don't think it's just Tasmania. We should be taking way more than we do. We take very small numbers compared to other First World nations in the world, and it's kind of a disgrace. That's my opinion. I think Tasmania could benefit greatly from people from all over the world coming. But Scott? Maybe.
Hank, that it's very astute the way that you've got that at the front of your brain and those figures and things. What strikes me is if I'd lost a daughter, running across a border into another country, and then had my family perhaps disintegrate and get back together, we were separated in camps, etc., in another country, and I was a pharmacist who was now treated like somebody who was untrained, and my sons had their bout of testosterone in a camp where, with a 600% rise in testosterone in their system, and their muscle bulk changed, and their anger picked up on that, and I was, coming to a place. Let's forget the politicisation of it at the moment. It is a collection of traumas and narratives and gifts and culinary ability and cultural perspectives that are both absolute gifts for a country like ours, which is still, it's just taken its first what have we done breath after the carnage of our war with the First Nations here. And to have those people come here is an absolute opportunity, but it's not one to be treated lightly or from an economic perspective. It's one to be treated from how are these human beings going to be welcomed and transform us and us transform them. And it's a complex issue. So in my community, I would love my daughter to have much more cultural input from families of people who were coming to be placed in the Hank system on the northwest coast of Tasmania. And then I would want to make sure that there was really solid best practice community culture development happening around that influx of story and trauma and brilliance and sadness and criminality and wonderfulness.
And I think that question sits really neatly with the first question, because in terms of the Tasmanian community and how it can come together, and I think it's fair to say, and I'm not being totally chauvinistic here about Tasmania, that we as a community have been distinctively generous in relation to our response to asylum seekers from what I call the Tampa time. There's a story that was described most eloquently by Richard Flanagan about how the local community hid a young man called Akif Lutfiu, who was a Kosovo Albanian refugee who came, and then, he was literally hidden in safe houses, including by the bus driver who used to drive him around as a detainee, and then was captured by immigration officials and deported back to Kosovo. So the story ended not very happily. But we have, as a community, at least then had an instinctive generosity about us, and I would like to see that protected and fostered, bearing in mind that, there are some practical issues to deal with. Someone else?
Hi. I think the image of Tasmania on the mainland has really changed dramatically. In the 1970s...
What's your name, sorry?
Changed dramatically.
What's your name, sorry?
Jim Davidson.
Jim, thanks.
And in the 1970s, for example, Adelaide led the field. We had Don Dunstan and the Adelaide Festival and Max Harris and so on and so forth. And Tasmania was seen as a land of all the jokes and diamond-shaped family trees. And I used to go to Tasmania quite a lot, and people often used to wonder why I went there. I think what has happened is the position of Tasmania and Adelaide in Melbourne, their image of them has become reversed. That people aren't really aware of South Australia anymore, but everybody seems to be aware of Mona and seems to be aware of the gourmet holidays you can have and so on and so forth. So that there has been this dramatic reversal of these two smaller states when viewed from Melbourne.
Thanks.
Well, I would agree with you. My question is to you Melburnians, because you like black, is Tasmania the new black? And how long will that, is that just a fashion? Is it sustainable? Where are we headed? I think I will ask the panellists to respond to that. Favel, what do you think?
I think I think it is sustainable. I think that people have been, before Mona, I think tourism was on the increase, and Wineglass Bay, for example, people always want to go there. There's great walking, there's great wilderness, and I think that the PR and marketing for that happened before Mona, and I think that a lot of people were going down for weekends and sort of... but Mona definitely has changed things, and what I've noticed is Mona has... people will fly in for the day just to go to Mona.
And then go back straight to the airport.
And they might see a little bit of the wharf in Salamanca, but it might make them come back another time because they realise, oh, actually there's way more than Mona to see. The other thing I was surprised at last time I was there was the international cruise ships docking there with however many thousands of people flooding into Salamanca and around, and that's a massive change.
Yes.
It's not something that you would have seen 10 years ago, but I think it's sustainable.
Would either of you like to comment on that?
I've got a little social experiment that I've been watching the last couple of years just to see how, I guess the dream of the Tasmanian idyllic escape works. And there's this couple, gorgeous, very young, groovy couple running a little cafe in Battery Point. And they just opened the first time that I went and had breakfast there on one of my recent, it was an Antarctic Division preparation trip, I think. And I dropped in again about 6 months later, again about 8 months later I was in town, and most recently, again, they're probably, I think, heading toward their second anniversary. And I've seen them go through this kind of starry-eyed, excited process. They'd left, I think, Brunswick and Fitzroy, and they'd packed everything up and invested everything in this tiny little hole-in-the-wall tea room, growing their own herbs and milking almonds or something. Very good, gorgeous and groovy, but as far as I know, I'm the only person I've ever seen eating in there. And little by little they're looking a bit more crestfallen, and by Christmas they were desperate to come home. And I said to them, do you think you're going to hang in there? And they would, I think there was a moment where they thought they weren't going to see out a year. And I guess it must be pretty isolating, and the financial aspect, I'm not sure they picked the smartest place for their little enterprise. We're across the road from a very busy establishment. But I kind of admire their tenacity and the fact that they did chase their dream, and as a young couple went down there and had a crack at a different kind of life and wanting a less crowded life, I think, and perhaps a lot of the same motivations as you. I think they've got real dreams about sustainability. And I'll be interested to see if they can make it, then maybe I will be brave enough.
I sometimes think we should provide some kind of cultural briefing for people like that, a bit the way DFAT does for diplomats, mapping the emotional and economic trajectories, because it is a very familiar thing. And even when I returned, after about 18 months, I hit a wall and thought, oh my God.
It's winter. That's where the
war... Oh my
God.
No, I very nearly left, but I didn't. So I think I think we could... I'm not being entirely flippant when I say there would be ways of supporting people through that. Scott, what do you think about this question of, the new noir, and will it last?
I don't think it's new, and I don't think Mona's that important, and I don't think Mona is any more than a wonderful piece of architecture with an okay collection of stuff. But I do think it's an absolutely pitch-perfect public dialogue that those dudes are having with the broader community, and it's, it's gobsmacking in its precision and nuanced poetry, and really beautiful to watch. Mona is having a kind of magnetic attraction to a certain kind of demographic, and it's more like, being just slapping the mainland in the face and go, Tasmania, that's right. There is a bit of that happening, but it's at a much deeper level. What I think is attracting people and is sustainable, and it's not to do with branding, but branding affects it, and it's in the emerging inner life, if you like, of the place, that's based on a statewide community with some fantastic values that are forged in being an economic basket case for most people there, aside from a few resource companies and the squattocracy. Now, personally, I'm not interested in Hobart. I would never live there. I sail there. It's cute, but it's a little city. If I want a city, I'd be here or whatever. I mean, it's fine. But the thing about the island is in the hinterlands of thought and excellence, and the people up the road from me who dropped in a thing that they're calling a lamb ham, which is like salted meat that was like you had on a sailing ship when people first came here. Magnificent. I mean, I liked it, but Rebecca hated it. But it is in that new kind of boutique infrastructure that is happening, and it's not snobbish. It's not about upper elites and echelons who are, have the wherewithal to do it. It's about fucking hard work that a lot of people are doing to make use of that incredible incredible rainfall. If you want, you mentioned Cape Grim. You can buy it at Rockpool here for $110 for a eye fillet, or you can buy a complete eye fillet. Like you can buy the steak here, or you can at the IGA just down the road from me for $80, and you could have 25 steaks.
Or you could live on Bruny Island and smash oysters off the rocks.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm raving, but just to pull it in, I don't think it's. We just tend to go there to the economics first, or the tourism and branding first. But I think it's a much deeper, it's a much longer trajectory, and there are symbols of it in the political firsts that Tasmania has pushed through that overgoverned place to do with recompense for people and shifting things that were very serious issues in Tasmania. It's a very innovative. Place to live.
Well, I'm glad one of our questioners mentioned Andrew Inglis Clark and the Hare Clark system, because that's what my centre's named afterwards, because he was a 19th century innovator as a lawyer and Democrat and politician with an enormous engagement with the global. And so you could argue it's not new, and that maybe, as Julianne's introduction is subheaded "Oscillating Wildly," maybe that's what Tasmania does, goes like this all the time, or spirals, and let's hope it keeps spiralling up, not down. I think we have to wrap it up. I've got someone's raised. No, we've got one more question.
Yes, good evening. My name's Peter Mack. I'm not a Tasmanian, but I do have a lot of experience there, and I have children who live there now. On a high note, I had some friends from England here on the weekend, and they just had a visit to Tasmania. They were shocked by what they saw around Dunelly. But they loved Tasmania. They thought it was a magnificent place, and they regretted they hadn't been there before. I would contest a couple of points that have been made by some of your speakers. My own experience, my grandmother was a Tasmanian. My wife comes from a family named Jordan in Tasmania, in which there is a book written. It's about 250 pages. My wife was born, obviously, in Hobart. She was born in Hobart. We, as a family, went to live in Hobart at the beginning of 1983, and I was there for a period of 4 years. One of the things that struck me early in the piece was the division between the north part of the island and the south part of the island. And I came to a realisation very quickly that that division was worse than the apparent hatred that existed between Sydney and Melbourne. I've come here tonight in the hope that you're going to tell me... Well, sorry, before I get onto that, Mona, contrary to what Scott's saying, I think Mona has been an outstanding thing. I haven't seen it. I know who David Walsh is, and I know the sort of investment he has made. And I think there is no doubt that most people going to Tasmania, the first place they go to is to Mona. And I think the numbers attending Mona would certainly support that. But I did come here tonight in the hope that I might have heard a little bit more about the title Tipping Point. What is the economic future for Tasmania? Tasmania. I've listened to Scott talk about boutique little this and little that. The reality is that doesn't work. It works for a few people. I did work in government in Tasmania. I worked in partnership with the former Tasmanian Development Authority, and it was a good idea at the time, but I think here we are 30 odd years down the track and not much has been achieved. It concerns me.
I'll just, because we are running out of time. Could you just, if you want to wrap up with the question, then I'll.
All right.
Yeah.
It does concern me that manufacturing industry in Tasmania is effectively dead, and I really wonder what is going to succeed it and what's going to take the place forward. The man in the front talked about a population of 500 or 1,000 or thereabouts. Greg Barnes, I think in a recent article in the Mercury, talked about there are 150,000 Tasmanians on welfare.
Okay, well,
this is what worries me.
We'll take that as the question. Okay, so the question is, what's the economic future of Tasmania? Partly, I'd urge you to read the whole issue because there are other contributors who deal with that directly, and also go online because Greg has written online, and we have more pieces in the pipeline, including a quite exciting one tomorrow or early next week. Would any of you like to respond to that directly?
Well, thank you. Where I live, if you have a forest that's, the Tarkine, it's interesting. You can do some mining there and you can cause some damage and it'll be kind of fixed up. But if you're one of the and I don't think I said it with a boutique in any sense of derision. One of the huge collection of variable sizes of agricultural pursuits on the northwest coast, all of whom are vying for, or almost all of whom are vying for, the very top echelon of produce. It's going to do you long-term damage it's going to take 10% off your value to have that industry go ahead. Now, it's not my thing, but somebody needs to do the maths about the short term and the long term. And Tony Burke, has been, I think, politically expedient and done that. Braddon, Sid Sidebottom is in a perilous place. I think it's going to be useful to him for his constituents, and I think the rest of us will suffer for some time. So, yes, economics is a important question, but I think it's a measure of what's wrong in most discussions when we go straight to economics.
Would either of you like to add to that?
I think it's worth mentioning that the research enterprise employs something like 3,500 Tasmanians directly at the moment. It's worth something like $500 million a year in investment, with enormous potential to grow. And we've been a bit preoccupied, I guess, with this, the public good science and the blue sky science, but there's a lot of industry-focused work on aquaculture, particularly, and agriculture, that's being pursued by some of the cooperative research centre type arrangements out of CSIRO, which are really quite exciting. And then around the enterprise, you've got things like there's a sort of a provisioning outfit. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's people like who have developed expertise in waste management out of remote locations like Antarctica. Scientific teams are obliged under the Antarctic Treaty to remove absolutely everything from the ice. So you've got this incredible expertise that's developed to be able to assist people, assist nations do that. I think the French are about to dock their vessel there, or they've already got a vessel there permanently. I think someone else is talking about a permanent vessel.
I think China.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about the hunt for the million-year core, which is another big scientific project that's probably, if that gets going, you're talking about a massive full-time effort drilling through the ice to pull out an ancient ice core to see what's within that can tell us about climate history. So I think there's boundless jobs, and not just for the boffins and the pointy heads. There's this whole enterprise around there that is required to support them.
Favel, do you want to add to that?
No, I don't really have anything to add. Growing up in a community that lost a paper mill and then, other industries, and seeing unemployment go to 80% or whatever, and a saving grace in one way was the aquaculture, the salmon farms. But yeah, it's hard, isn't it, when you live in remote areas and the main industries are gone? What do you do? Do you move? Do you stay and try and hang on?
Yeah.
And it's difficult. I don't know the answer.
And in a way, I mean, the beautiful late Margaret Scott used to call Tasmania the jelly bag of Australia. She had this idea that all the concentrated flavour dripped down and collected in us, so that what we see in Tasmania is simply a more intense and sometimes beautiful, sometimes more brutal version of battles and conversations and challenges being played out that are actually pertain to the whole of the nation. So my challenge back to all of us is, what are the lessons for wider Australia from what's going in the laboratory that's Tasmania? And that is where I will wrap up. I'll alert you to a lovely competition that's associated with the book. Tourism Tasmania and Mona have generously provided a prize for 2 people to travel for a weekend from any Australian capital city and stay in the spectacular Mona pavilions and get into the Red Queen exhibition for free and get a catalogue. And so when you can register your purchase to be in the running for that. I would like to thank our panellists tonight and indeed all our contributors. One of the things I love about this issue and the way, as I said, it's flown off the shelves, it's a reminder that content is king or queen, and people still do want to read books and still hold them. And without our contributors and the really, really impressive variety of voices, strong voices in this volume, that wouldn't have happened. And I thank you all for coming tonight. Again, books are nothing without the audience, and an event is nothing without the people who listen and participate. And thank you to everybody for those really, really interesting questions.